The shelter was never silent. The clang of metal doors, the echo of barks colliding in the air, the sharp sting of disinfectant clinging to every breath. But in the far corner, behind a row of rusted kennels, silence had taken root. A German shepherd, old enough that his muzzle had begun to gray, stood pressed against the iron bars, his nose damp, his eyes hollow. He did not bark. He did not pace. He simply leaned into the cold steel as though the wall itself were the last thing tethering him to the world. Every passerby looked, but no one stopped. Too old, too thin, too broken. He seemed invisible, fading deeper into himself with each hour. His ribs showed through his coat. His ears sagged like wilted flags. Yet in his eyes was a flicker, the last stubborn ember of hope. And then, one morning, as the light cut through the shelter windows and touched the dust in the air, footsteps slowed. A hand reached toward the bars. The shepherd lifted his head, pressed his nose harder against the metal, and in that single fragile gesture, a story began that would change everything.
The shelter was loud with desperate voices, but in the farthest corner lived a silence more painful than sound. The German shepherd, once strong, now stood still, his nose pressed endlessly against the rusted bars. His body was thin, his coat dull, his eyes hollow but faintly glowing with something, perhaps memory, perhaps hope. The staff whispered that he had shut down. He no longer barked when visitors walked past. He no longer rushed to the front of the kennel. Days blurred into nights, and the quiet ones, everyone knew, were always the first to be overlooked. In overcrowded shelters, time was a cruel enemy, and the shepherd's was running out. His name was crossed onto a list that carried a finality no animal deserved. One morning, when the shelter's light broke across the rows of cages, footsteps slowed near his corner. A woman crouched, not drawn to the loud puppies or the playful young dogs, but to the silent shepherd whose breath fogged against the steel. She stretched her hand close, waiting, uncertain. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the shepherd leaned forward, pressing his nose against her fingers, a gesture so small, yet heavy with meaning. It was the first time in weeks he had reached for anyone. But adoption was not simple. Papers had warnings scribbled across them: severe malnutrition, weak heart, may not survive. The staff advised caution, urging her to reconsider. Yet the woman could not unfeel that moment of connection. Against the weight of reason, she decided he would not die behind bars.
The ride home nearly ended in tragedy. The shepherd collapsed in the back seat, his body limp, breath shallow. Panic filled the car as she turned toward the vet's office, her voice breaking as she begged him to hold on. Under sterile lights, the truth unfolded. Malnutrition had weakened his organs, infection spread through his body, dehydration had pushed him to the edge. The vet spoke gently but firmly. "Prepare yourself. He may not make it through the night." The woman stayed by the steel table, stroking his head, whispering promises into the darkness. And somehow, when morning broke, he was still alive.
Recovery was not a single miracle, but a series of fragile victories. He flinched at sudden sounds, cowered from hands too quick, refused food unless she sat quietly beside him. But then, a breakthrough. His first full meal. His tail wagging faintly one evening as she entered the room. The day he curled at her feet and finally closed his eyes, trusting her enough to sleep. Sunlight began to matter again. Fresh air on his fur during cautious walks became a reminder that he was still part of the living world. The scars remained, but slowly he began to look not backward at loss, but forward at possibility.
Months later, the shepherd no longer looked like the shadow pressed against steel. His coat shone again, his gait was steady, his eyes carried light instead of emptiness. One evening, in the quiet of their home, the woman knelt before him. No cold bars between them now, only warmth. He leaned forward and pressed his nose into her hand, the same gesture that began their story, but this time it was not desperate. It was trust. It was love. And with it came the unshakable truth. Even the faintest ember of hope can spark a fire when the right person appears.